So I grew up in Massachusetts, and Lowell is near and dear to my heart. We all go to visit it on school trips, and it's a remarkable place for considering the sort of dawn of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And Professor, you've told us already about the decline of New England farming and the rise of the factor system and factories and how these together generate a need for labor, and then how the Lowell system, the Waltham-Lowell system, allows a kind of marriage of the moral imperative of the home with young women going off to work in these mills, how boarding houses provide strict discipline, how the mills themselves are seen as training grounds for submissiveness, for domesticity, and how money was sent back then to support families, fathers, brothers, younger siblings. And the system for a time provides good wages, offers education to young women. It opens new opportunities for them to encounter one another, to socialize. And yet the center can't quite hold. Eventually this system begins to break down. I was hoping you could tell us about that.
The system does begin to break down, and it breaks down not eventually, but fairly quickly from a historian's perspective. So the mills open, the first mills, and just one or two of them in 1820. By 1836, 37, they're already. So we're talking about 15 years. They have, of course, been built up, and they've already become a kind of model to be emulated. But then a big depression hits in 1837. And at the same time, competition for cotton textiles increases as products begin to pour in once again from Britain. And the question becomes, how do the mill owners make a profit? Well, to make a profit, they do several things. They cut wages, they speed up work, they take women who'd been responsible for supervising four spinning looms and give them 6 or sometimes even 8 spinning looms. And they run the factories for longer hours, from dawn to dusk. Now, all of these things, which come in slowly and added up together, in fact, try to resolve the mill owners' economic problems, but they make a mockery of the compromise which had encouraged women to come into the mills to begin with. Because those women immediately, by the early 1840s, are saying, wait a minute, you know, we used to have time to read after work, or to join sewing classes, or to maintain our levels of knowledge. And now we don't have time to do that. We used not to be so tired because we didn't have quite so much work to do. And now we're exhausted at the end of the day. And do we now have enough wages to actually send them home? Well, for a while that debate is eluded, but then beginning in the 1840s, the boarding houses begin to raise their rates. And a raise in rates in the boarding houses without a comparable wage rate means that the women are now really hurting, and they complain that they no longer have enough extra money even to buy a ribbon, much less send money home or save it for an education. And the boarding houses are becoming more crowded, so they're having to sleep 2 to a bed instead of 1 to a bed. So all of these conditions seem to vitiate the compromise that had enabled them to go work in the first place. And women respond by forming a Lowell Female Reform Association, and the Lowell Female Reform Association publishes a paper of its own. You know, the girls, the women, under the sponsorship of the mills, had published something called had published something called the Lowell Offering in the 1830s. But now the voice of industry, which is the voice of the protesting young women, emerges. And these women are vocal in their opposition to the deteriorating conditions of the mills.
And how do the mill owners and the sort of male leaders of places like Lowell respond to these women as they protest?
Well, the first thing they try to do is to try to find other women to replace them. So they send around these, what they're called Black Mariahs, because they're black wagons, to New Hampshire and Vermont and the small deteriorating towns and farms, still offering high wages and begging people to come to the mills. And they do so by encouraging women to sign a contract with them. Basically, they won't pay the women. They'll transport them to the mill and they'll pay their early boarding expenses, but then they will deduct these expenses from a wage which they will only get if they complete a whole year at the mill. And so women come and they spend 4 or 5 months, but of course there's an enormous amount of dissatisfaction now with the conditions of work. And finally, by 1845, 1846, the mill owners begin to look elsewhere for labor, and they find it in the incoming Irish immigrant population, which very slowly, beginning in the late 40s and the early 50s, replaces the old mill population. Now, this new working population is very happy to have a job. They're immigrants, of course, and they need a job. Though they would like to have the extra money, any job that keeps body and soul together is good, so they're willing to take the lower wages. And as the wages drop, relatively speaking, even further, the New England mill girl is slowly driven out of the industry.
It's interesting, she does eventually fade out, but she doesn't go quietly. There are a number of strikes, we might not call them strikes, but protests early on, even as early as the 1830s, in which these women call upon ideals of, I think, the American Revolution, the Young Republic, in protesting their conditions.
Yeah, exactly right. So the earliest strikes, actually there's one sort of walkout in 1828. There's another at Lowell itself in 1834, where women protest the conditions of work. But as they march down the street with banners, and here they're protesting their right to continue to be ladies, they are attacked by taunts from the largely male watchers, claiming that they can't be ladies if they're walking the streets. After all, they're engaged in unladylike behavior, even as they're asking for a greater degree of, you might say, leisure time or greater amenities in the boarding houses. So those strikes don't really do much good. And then, of course, in the 1840s, it becomes very difficult to strike per se because the workers become relatively easily replaceable by the Black Mariahs, by women who are now bound and can't leave so easily, or they can't leave without collecting their wages, and by the incoming Irish population. So the protests are, many of them, in writing, and we see them, for example, in letters that the women write to their families at home. And we have, of course, records of these letters in which they say, we are now being worked too hard, I wish I'd never seen a mill, and so on. And they respond by comparing their situation to the situations of slaves. And so we have songs of the mill girls saying, I cannot be a slave, I will not be a slave. Our fathers fought for liberty in the American Revolution, and look at us now, you're treating us just like slaves. And so, as this sort of consciousness begins to enter the minds of women, they become less attractive workers in the first place, and the New England mill girls. They disappear themselves in a way, but are pushed out as their labor is replaced by others.
So the compact between mill owners and patriarchs, the vision of domesticity preserved in a factory setting, breaks down. But so does the promise to young women of independence.
Exactly. And it does so, the fact that that compact or compromise breaks down so very quickly is a lesson, not just for women of the time, but for us as historians. So the possibility of women maintaining their own economic independence and or supporting families, either their own future families or their brothers and parents with their earnings, that promise is retained, but at a huge cost. And the cost is the cost of female delicacy, if you like. That is, it becomes clear after the Lowell experiment that you cannot do both, that you cannot both be a virtuous woman, a good woman, a woman who adheres to the domestic code, and work in a factory at the same time. And that's the ongoing lesson.